This is AWANI Global with me, Nailah Huda. And this month we take you through a series of reflections and reviews from the year 2025, with this episode looking specifically at environmental issues and the climate crisis in Southeast Asia. Surely a timely topic, as several countries in the region are still recovering from the recent historic rainfall and its impact, causing flooding, landslides, and just over 1,000 fatalities recently recorded in Indonesia alone. So at this hour, we want to unpack some of the impact of these environmental issues, the climate crisis, review throughout the year, and what we can expect in the coming year. So joining us to unpack some of these questions, these key shifts and trends, we have joining us Edmund, Malaysia's representative to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, AICHR, and chair of AICHR of 2025. And also joining us, we have Aidil, Iman, Aidid, founder of Kolektif Iklim. Thank you so much, Edmund and Aidil, for joining us on AWANI Global. Maybe I'll start with Aidil, just some overall thoughts over the past year. Do you think 2025 marked perhaps a turning point in the climate crisis for the region, or perhaps even globally?
Right. Thank you so much, Naila. And I think 2025 was definitely in the last few months, we've seen a lot of extreme weather events that really shocked the entire region, especially in Southeast Asia. You rightly pointed out the floods that were happening in Sumatra, in Indonesia, where decades of land conversion, unsustainable land use, and destabilization of ecosystems were being connected to the impacts of climate change, causing the loss of lives, but also reflecting how a country was managing its land use, and as well as huge increased activities of logging. But we can also look in other parts of Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, with the two typhoons that recently hit, Typhoon Tino and Typhoon Uwan, where more than 1 million people in the Philippines were displaced because of these super typhoons. And there a connection of how the climate crisis is interlinked with these typhoons, but also looking at how communities, in light of the recent COP30 in Belém, Brazil, were advocating for a more polluters pay principle, asking for compensation, asking for us to divert from fossil fuels, because these were activities that were inducing climate change effects within these countries particularly. So we've seen a lot of these cases, and in Malaysia, we're no stranger to the impacts of climate change. Our flooding is becoming much worse, our rainfall is becoming more intense, and that's all coupled with a lot of unsustainable land use change, a lot of ecosystem degradation. And I think there is a really pivotal moment where we need to connect the two between biodiversity loss and climate change.
Edmund, of course, we want to talk about the Environmental Rights Declaration from ASEAN, a landmark declaration in the last summit. But before that, perhaps you have some observations, some of the key trends. Do you see 2025 as sort of a turning point in how governments and how the world is trying to cope with these challenges?
The main argument really at the moment is to ensure that we infuse the human rights-based approach to protect vulnerable groups, populations, indigenous people, and even human rights defenders, looking at it from a really human rights-based perspective. Environmental sustainability and governance has always been looked at from purely an environmental science approach, perspective. And I think here with human rights now playing a very important role at the UN and in different regional organizations, the ASEAN Declaration embeds and deepens ASEAN's commitment to look at it more from a rights-based approach.
Aidil, this is one of many pledges, commitments made by governments across the region on the climate crisis. But, coming to the end of 2025 now, where do you think we stand on delivering some of these promises, Aidil?
I think not enough. I think if we look into the recent COP30 in Belém, Brazil, countries generally did not agree on really important roadmaps to transition away from fossil fuels and halting deforestation. I think that was lacking in core text within the COP30 process. In fact, the outcome was to Brazil to lead different international discussions outside of these formal COP processes. But I would say that at least one good outcome that came out of COP would be the decision to set up a just transition mechanism to really foster and advocate for international cooperation. But these are small wins, and there leaves a lot of gaps within the COP30 outcomes where we have not addressed directly on transitioning away from fossil fuels and halting deforestation.
On that note, Edmund, tell us a little bit more about the ASEAN Environmental Rights Declaration. I believe the last time we spoke, you told us a little bit about the efforts in trying to get the buy-in, the support for this. It's a long time making.
Yeah, it was very difficult, taken us 2-3 years. But during our chairship, we have fortunately been able to gather around the table and say, hey, look, this problem is a big problem. We need to go and sort this declaration out. So the declaration has now been adopted, the right to a safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment. We adopted it at the 47th ASEAN Summit. Alongside, importantly, a second declaration, the Declaration on Promoting the Right to Development and Right to Peace towards Realizing Inclusive and Sustainable Development. So these were two flagship declarations that Malaysia has championed at the AICHR. We have now deepened the ASEAN commitment on the rights, especially on the right to safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment and development as a first step. So it's not the end, but it's the first step towards addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and toxic pollution, alongside inclusive and sustainable development. The declaration is very important because first, it aligns and commits ASEAN member states to implementing multilateral treaties, including the treaties that we've signed in the Paris Agreement, the CBD, and there's a lot there that really needs to be taken from a human rights-based approach, while reinforcing the different aspects of human rights development, peace, and environment through strengthened cooperation. So these are very key milestones because we have now also recognized in the ASEAN member states the importance and the vulnerabilities that are intersecting of different groups, especially groups from the indigenous populations, local communities, people who live in rural areas, women and children, persons with disabilities. And a plan of action now is being drafted to try and implement and operationalize it. It's not going to be easy because the difficulties, as Aidil has mentioned, are very evident. We need to really take a whole of ASEAN approach, get all governments on board, get our leaders agreeing to how we can promote and protect those in vulnerable and marginalized situations. The world is not in a very good place now, and I think we need to really accelerate it and try and make the declarations that we have signed up to something a bit more binding, something a bit more having teeth as an enforcement mechanism. So the regional action plan allows for a bit more of this reporting and updating, as well as trying to share good practices of countries in meeting these challenges.
You mentioned this as an important first step towards something more with more teeth, more legally binding, with a bit of enforcement mechanism. How do you think this would look like in the future, realistically?
Realistically, because ASEAN is an association, it's like a club of member states. It is not like the EU. It's not supranational national where we have laws that are implemented strictly by way of a framework that is adopted in the EU Parliament. Association like ASEAN, we have a system what I would call, and some academics call, adaptive protection, meaning we have regular meetings. At the regular meetings, we have self-assessments, as well as we have monitoring and evaluation tools that promote the reporting and get countries to share what they have done to implement the declaration. And then looking at gaps and challenges. So we do a gap analysis and then try and link them up with our commitments in COP, our commitments in the UN, and see, hey, we have made those commitments globally. Why have we not been meeting them at ASEAN? So in a sense, the regional human rights mechanism that we are on, the AICHR, looks into this monitoring and evaluation framework and says and recommends making advisory notes, making recommendations and saying, this is good, but it may not be enough. Let's do more, and where can we do more on those areas?
And one last point, would this in any way build on past precedent cases, such as perhaps the ASEAN agreement on transboundary haze pollution? That was one of the sort of agreements, one of the treaties that was signed in 2002 in response to the environmental crisis, a haze issue. Would this in any way build upon that? There were, sort of a few criticisms towards that treaty not being, legally binding, not having enough teeth, as you said. How would this perhaps build on some of the cases that have happened in the past in ASEAN?
The declaration builds on all ASEAN agreements, all regional agreements, and all international multilateral agreements. It's very wide. So it includes a haze agreement. It includes declarations on migrant workers who are affected by the climate, even children on migration. So ASEAN has a lot of these declarations, and it builds on it by saying, look, if there is an approach or if there's a human rights lens that affects, whether directly or indirectly, these populations by way of an environmental or climate change challenge or barrier, then this declaration kicks in. And this declaration is very important because for the first time now in ASEAN, we have recognized the responsibility and accountability of non-state actors. So it's not just governments. The burden is not only shouldered on governments, but it is to be shouldered also by companies, by corporations. And in a lot of advocacy methods, in a lot of civil society engagement, this declaration can now be used to not only augment and strengthen our SDG commitments and our goals towards meeting those targets, but also to tell companies, hey, you're not doing enough. So the issue of fossil fuel, the issue of just transition, fair transition, where are we at? This declaration talks also about access to remedies and access to justice for these populations. AICHR, this year in 2025, we have created a formal mechanism for a receipt of communications. So we are very happy to hear about cases, especially transboundary cases by non-state actors or by governments, hear about the cases, and we will then decide among ourselves, as well as discussing with our national human rights institutions, how we can make recommendations to address some of these cases.
Right. Aidil, earlier you were talking a little bit about how we're not doing enough, we're not acting fast enough. But I guess in trying to be a little bit more optimistic, do you think there were perhaps any countries, any cities, any bodies in Southeast Asia that maybe stood out this year for getting climate policy, environmental policy right, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, and I think the most really sort of momentous moment of this year was definitely the launch of the Tropical Forest Forever facility, the TFFF. So this was launched, this was spearheaded by the Brazilian government, but was also shouldered by other tropical countries such as Malaysia in anchoring this sort of financing instrument or financing platform for tropical countries to be incentivized for each hectare of forest that they protect. So this is a really new, unique way of looking of how we can finance forest protection amongst these countries. And Malaysia really played a critical role in shaping this outcome, right? So Malaysia was a part of a lot of the technical processes, and now we've seen other countries like Indonesia being on board of the TFFF. And I think this is really important because it envisions a direct access of mechanisms for not just countries, but also indigenous peoples and local communities where their participation in forest governance can be really crucial. And what role Malaysia plays here in this financing instrument to protect forests amongst tropical countries is that I think we do have a role in a lot of the support system, particularly on how we can design a more transparent process, a more fair process, and a more inclusive process where indigenous and local communities can access that kind of funding from this global financing instrument. I think that was a really pivotal moment that I would like to highlight from 2025, where a lot of tropical countries, not just within Southeast Asia, but around the world, were joining hands in hand in launching this financing instrument. So I think other civil society organizations like WWF and also Greenpeace have also come on board to support a more transparent process, an equitable process of the TFFF. So this is a really great initiative that I think we need to focus on within the next few years of how countries can get money to finance their forest protection, because a lot of tropical countries are still economies that are dependent on extractive activities, on activities that require logging, mining, and land use change that also destabilizes our capacity to adapt to climate change. So this is one of the sort of victorious moments of 2025 where civil society organizations, activists, advocates, and even governments, particularly in the tropical regions, are really happy to hear about. And I hope that Malaysia, countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and the rest of the Southeast Asian countries can play a really important role in shaping its outcome, making sure that we get the money to protect our forests and biodiversity, that it supports local communities and indigenous peoples, but also that we make sure that the TFFF process is equitable, fair, and transparent.
Edmund, where do you think ASEAN stands globally in the process of drafting the Environmental Rights Declaration? Did you perhaps, draw on lessons learned from other regions, perhaps?
Yeah, so we have a lot of these earthquakes and typhoons. It's very unfortunate. So it's really sad that this is happening, and the weather is getting more unpredictable. I think we are all feeling it. But this year in 2025, when we set out as ASEAN chair and AICHR chair what we wanted to do, we have completed what we have suggested as proposed as our target. So we ended on a high note. We are actually here now in a room discussing how we can look into a regional action plan. I've really full confidence that continuing this under the leadership of Philippines, we can continue to have a more robust agenda to develop and ensure that these international standards and our common positions are taken on board. Unfortunately, ASEAN needs to negotiate stronger as a bloc of 11 in COP. If you do not come within blocks, it's very difficult for ASEAN to have the voices and the concerns of our peoples at the international fora. And I think that challenge really needs to be met in 2026. We have learned a lot because we have heard really from the voices of people from the ground when we were doing consultations for the declaration. And we did not know, or I did not know the extent of the seriousness of the issue that they were facing. Now we are starting to see climate refugees. We are starting to see barriers and forcing migrant workers to move because of climate change. So there is some pessimism, but there's also some optimism that it only means we have to double our efforts. We need to accelerate our work and ensure our commitments are not just on paper, but translated into practice.
On that note, you mentioned about handing over the chair to the Philippines next year. If you had to prioritize or narrow down to just one or two key deliverables that you hope will be prioritized in the next year, what do you think they would be, Edmund?
Yeah, so very simply, we are looking at this declaration's regional plan of action, and we would invite all civil society, we would invite all governments to provide inputs. We received more than 200 over inputs for the declaration. We are now operationalizing it. So we want the inputs from the RPA. If you ask me what the priorities are really in the many areas of substantive and procedural rights. So freedom of information, a safe and enabling environment, meaningful public participation, as well as ensuring the substantive commitments to a safe climate, non-toxic environment, sustainable food, clean water and sanitation. These things, while they may sound very simple for a lot of us who are more fortunate, are actually still barriers for many ASEAN member states on the ground. And that really has been impacting the rights of these many groups who are still left behind.
Aidil, you described the year 2025 as this critical juncture. So if this past year served as a warning, what do you think should be prioritized? What must change urgently in 2026 for you, Aidil?
Yeah, I think in 2026, I think it's important for the region to look into the package between biodiversity and also climate. 53% of the Asia Pacific economy is dependent on nature, but however, we've seen a 60% decline in wildlife populations in the Asia Pacific from the 1970s up until 2020. And a lot of the funding that goes into climate funding goes into climate mitigation, but very less so in climate adaptation. In fact, 8% of climate financing in the Asia Pacific region only goes directly into climate adaptation, where the remaining 91% goes to climate change mitigation between 2018 to 2019. So it's critical that the next year we move forward into building more adaptation capacity within the region, where we focus more on funding climate adaptation efforts, because we're not a large emitter as a region compared to other wealthier countries or economies. So I think there needs to be a sort of redirection towards funding more adaptation strategies that help communities, that help countries adapt to typhoons, floods, and other climate change induced weather effects, but also looking into how we can invest in nature-based solutions to scale up our ability to not just adapt to the impacts of climate change, but also to mitigate climate change or greenhouse gases through carbon stocks, right? So I think that is a critical point within the next year of how Malaysia can look into the two different processes that are going to happen, which is COP31 hosted by Turkey, but also COP17 under the Convention on Biological Diversity happening in Armenia. So the two COPs are happening next year. And that those are really two important events where we can link climate and biodiversity together, because we have always been looking at these two independently in silos. And I think the region harboring so much biodiversity and harboring so much forest cover for both mitigation and adaptation can really lead into these kind of initiatives.
Aidil, of course, scientists paint a rather bleak future when we're talking about the climate crisis, the effects of climate change. But, you know, if we had to describe your feelings, you know, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the trajectory, the sort of climate trajectory, particularly in this region. You know, on one hand, we have this sort of, again, this bleak picture of what the future might look like if we were to continue with, you know, these economic activities, these extractive activities, and continue damaging our environment. But at the same time, as you said, we're seeing a lot more efforts on climate financing, on protecting some of our natural resources, our biodiversity. If you had to say, would you be optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
And I've been doing this for quite some time, for the last 7 years, and I've always been optimistic about the future. I think there's a lot of successful case studies or stories that are happening on the ground. I think there's a lot of potential of working with indigenous and local communities. I think we need to start treating a lot of these communities, particularly indigenous and local communities, IPLCs, and young people, as right holders. We can no longer see them as just stakeholders or people who are investing their time with doing advocacy and nature protection. We need to see them as right holders. I think this is a really my optimistic view of looking into how we can secure a lot of wins, even at the global level, when we empower communities, particularly indigenous peoples and young people, children, and other marginalized groups. Then we can secure a lot of victories in the first place. Only 1% of climate-related philanthropy or funding goes to indigenous peoples, and this is the same for a lot of youth groups as well. But I've always been optimistic to the kind of work they've done, despite these kind of limitations, being involved in these kind of initiatives myself and having these problems as well. So I'm always optimistic to see of how we can move from the bottom up to securing global agenda wins, especially towards the Paris Agreement, but also looking into the global biodiversity frameworks of how communities can be empowered to secure a more cohesive objective of between climate and nature. I think
Yeah.
a lot of my optimism comes from that on the ground.
Edmund, some final thoughts from you. What do you think? Are we on the right track? Is ASEAN and Southeast Asia, beyond the ASEAN framework, on the right track in terms of the climate trajectory?
Even if you look at the SDG goals and targets, we have passed the midway point, and we are still quite far behind. So while we have a lot of these barriers and challenges, I'm still very optimistic that if we can redouble our efforts, especially the message has to be to businesses and companies. It cannot be business as usual. And that's why the whole business and human rights agenda has exploded, because we know that businesses actually control so much of the supply chain, so much of the production, and so much of the things that impact the climate. So businesses have to stop greenwashing, whitewashing, and the commitments that they write in the sustainability reports really need to be translated to real action and real protection for people and the planet. Secondly, I think we need to be more assertive. Malaysia, in our negotiations, in our COP discussions, in all our international fora, has to be more assertive. We have, I think, taken sometimes a route that, for want of a better word, I think less assertive in ASEAN, because I think that's the way that a lot of us in ASEAN member states are. We are very simple, although we raise our voices, but sometimes what I see in negotiations and even among us in ASEAN is that it gets drowned out by countries in the global north. And we need to be more assertive as a bloc. We need to demand and show that with this declaration as an added weapon in our armory, we can show that ASEAN member states have agreed and committed to protecting vulnerable groups. And if we need more funding, we need more international cooperation, then that has to be asserted at international fora. We are not only talking about mitigation and adaptation. We are now talking about loss and damage. The fact is that the climate, there are things that are irreversible, that mitigation and adaptation can no longer help. And where are we going to get support and resources to support the loss and damage of populations that have been greatly impacted? So I think the message really from us at the Commission is that we are ready to join forces, work together. And while we are going to hold governments and hold businesses to account in whichever form, in terms of accountability, we will also want to cooperate with governments in a way to promote the declaration and ensure that really the human rights of the people, as well as of the safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment, is realized for the region.
And on that note, that wraps up our discussion today. Thank you so much, Edmund and Aidil, for sharing your thoughts on some of the most urgent environmental issues faced by the region today and tomorrow. That is all on AWANI Global at this hour with me, Nailah Huda. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.